Hi, and welcome to the Animal Welfare Junction. This is your host, Dr. G, and our music is written and produced by Mike Sullivan. Today, this is episode 3 of our season 1 series, State of Ohio versus Steffen Baldwin. And this episode is named Who is Steffen Baldwin? Because some of our followers may know some things about him, but I don't know that anybody really knows who Steffen was or is. So today we're going to learn a little bit about him. Just a reminder for our listeners, the series talks about sensitive topics such as animal abuse and domestic violence. So take care of yourself. If there's a part of this podcast that is hard for you to listen, take a break, hit the fast forward button, and come back where you're ready. Today we have a really special guest. We have author James Renner here to discuss with us about Stefan. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the Junction.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for having me. It's interesting. I met you in court, and I remember giving you a card, and I did not know the kind of tornado of activity that would follow that meeting, and then here we are talking about it, a couple months later, and it's still one of the most bizarre stories I've ever heard.
Yeah, right. And it's like the last episode was the rabbit hole because it is a rabbit hole. And you could not ask for more different types of scams in one individual as
Yeah.
all the things that Stefan has done.
That's for sure. Yeah. As I feel kind of like an archaeologist digging into his past and trying to figure out like what's authentic and what's not, what's stuff that he just made up. And it's been very difficult. But I do have a little insight into, who he was and where he came from.
For members of our audience that may not know who you are, can
Sure.
you let them know who you are and what you normally do?
Yeah, my name's James Renner. I'm a native Ohioan. I live here in Akron, Ohio. And I am mostly known for my true crime books. I started out as a reporter at a place up here called Scene, kind of like our Village Voice newspaper. And after Scene, I wrote books for full time. I've written a couple novels, but mostly true crime books. I'm mostly known for my book on the disappearance of Maura Murray. It's called True Crime Addict, and it came out in 2016. And this is about a young woman who was a student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And in February of 2004, she emailed her professors and said, "There's been a death in the family. Hold my work till the end of the week." And that was a lie. Nobody died in her family. She went to the bank, emptied out her bank account, which was only about 280 bucks or something, bought a bunch of liquor, way more liquor than like one person would need, then drove up into the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And around 7:30 that night, she crashed into a snowbank in front of like three houses on a country road. And so the people living in those homes heard the crash. They called 911. Between the time of the accident and when the first officer responded to the scene, it's a window of about 5 to 7 minutes. And sometime in that span of 5 to 7 minutes, more disappears, never to be seen again. They never found a body. They don't know what happened to her. They don't even know why she was up in the White Mountains to begin with. But of course, Maura, one thing you should know about her is before she became a student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, she was a cadet at West Point, and that becomes important in this story. Yeah, I'm a journalist. I'm a writer. I'm a storyteller. That's what I do.
Yeah, and you bringing this up because that's kind of why we met, right? Like you were not at Stefan's sentencing necessarily because of the crimes that he had done about the animals, but it's because he is somewhat related to the Maura Murray story.
Correct. Yes. So again, the book came out in 2016, and I still get tips sometimes about the case. I've got a website about the case, so people find me pretty easily. But over the years, those tips have kind of died off quite a bit. But I was in March one day, it's a Thursday. I'm sitting working on my podcast, and planning to have just a normal day. I got my cup of coffee. I sat down. 9 o'clock, I think it was 9 a.m. on the nose. My phone rings. And on the other end is a person who knows about the case. And it became a source for the story. And they said, "Hey, do you want to? Um, can I tell you a story?" And I'm always, sure. You called me, I'm assuming it's about a crime. Let's talk. And they started telling me the story about Stephen Baldwin and everything that happened with these animals. And it was a terrible story, but I had no idea what it had to do with me. And we talked for about 20 minutes, and finally I'm like, you know, I had this thought even like, oh, I got to find a way to get out of this conversation because this doesn't have anything to do with what I'm doing. And then this person tells me that after they happen to know that after Baldwin was arrested, the police entered his fingerprints into AFIS, which is the database that the FBI keeps for fingerprints. And the next day, the New Hampshire State Police called police here in Ohio and said, "Hey, we got a match to this fingerprint that you just put up in our database. And it's a match to the unsolved disappearance of Maura Murray." And so suddenly my ears perked up. I'm like, oh, okay, I know why this person is calling me now. So when Maura Murray got into that accident, they processed the car and they dusted it for prints. Somewhere inside the car, and I've been told by Stefan himself that it was found on a CD or CD case, that's where they found his fingerprint. I have not been able to confirm that with police, so I don't know for sure if that's where his fingerprint was, but they found his fingerprint connected to the case. And the lead detective at the time for the Moore Murray case was a man named Chuck West. And when he spoke to police here in Ohio, he told them Stefan had become his number one suspect in the case. And so suddenly I'm like, wow, I gotta see if I can, what's going on with Stefan? I gotta see if I can talk to this guy. And I was told that his sentencing was that very day. And coincidentally, it's here in Ohio. I think it was about a 2 hour drive from me. So I jumped in the car right away and I drove down to the courthouse. I'm not going to pass up that opportunity. And so I get to the courthouse about a half an hour before the sentencing. And I walk into the courthouse and, it's a Union County, right? Is where it was. Yeah. And
Yeah, correct.
it's a very small courthouse. And so there's not a lot of places to go. Anyways, I walk into the courthouse, walk upstairs, and there's Stefan standing outside the courtroom doors next to his lawyer. And I go up and introduce myself, and I realize this is probably the only opportunity I'm going to get to talk to this guy. So I started asking him questions right away. I said, "Do you remember Moore Murray?" And he said, "Yes." He said they met at West Point when they were both cadets there. This would have been back in 2001, 2000, 2001. Moore Murray was a cadet. Stefan was there. And he said they met there and he was very, very fond of her. He cared a lot for her. And I then learned that when they kind of met when she got in trouble at West Point, one of the times she got in trouble at West Point. And according to Stefan, and I'd heard this rumor before, but Maura was found after a night of partying, found passed out on the lawn on campus, and that's a big deal. That's a big infraction. So she had to go in front of the Judicial Review Board, and Stefan was one of the students that was helping with that process and helped her through the process of the Judicial Review Board. And they, for whatever reason, connected. Um, that's kind of a pattern in Stefan's life. These women that he meets and quickly becomes um, closer with, and that's what happened there. He said that he was in a relationship with Maura for a little while, and There is a little bit of proof of that because they both got in trouble one day when another cadet walked into Stefan's room and discovered Maura and Stefan in bed. And at West Point, it's a big deal if you're caught. The way they refer to it is if you're on the same horizontal surface as a member of the opposite sex. That's a big infraction. So Stefan got into some trouble for that, and so did Maura. Um, and so they essentially they were kind of hooking up, as young people do. And he wanted it to be a little bit more, and thought that maybe it was. But then one day they're on a bus traveling somewhere, and he asks her to sit with him, and she says, "No, I'm kind of seeing this other guy." And that's when she went over and sat next to this guy named Bill Roush, who she ends up in a very long-term relationship with, and he was her boyfriend at the time of the disappearance. So, he has this interaction with Maura, and I said, "Well, hey, how'd your fingerprint get in her car when she went missing? Because you knew her in 2001, and she went missing in 2004." Um, and he said that's when he said that the FBI, who talked to him just a year ago, by the way, he was, so he's still interesting to the investigation. Um, he says that they told him his fingerprint was found on a CD, and he's like, "Yeah, we used to, you know, when we were hanging out, I'd make CDs for her. I'd burn CDs and I'd give it to her, it's kind of like a mixtape." And he says, "So that's why my CD's on the car." In the car, or why my fingerprints in the car. But, I have a lot of questions about that, the least of which is like how long does a fingerprint stay on a CD, especially one that, more if you're listening to those CDs a lot. My biggest question is, was it on the CD that was actually in the player at the time of the accident? That would be very interesting to me, but the police have been very quiet about that. Um, Oh, one other thing about West Point that I found interesting is that neither Stefan nor Maura actually completed West Point. And they both left this institution that you fight really hard to get into. They both left within like a week or two of each other. Stefan left in December of 2001, and Maura left in January of 2002. The reason she left is she got caught stealing from the commissary at Fort Knox, and they were going to remove her from the Corps of Cadets, but they allowed her to withdraw before her, quote unquote sentencing. So she had to leave. It was kind of his choice to leave, and for somebody like Stefan who really doesn't like to fail in anything, that's a big question for me. Like, why did Stefan leave West Point when he only had 2 years to go? Um, so maybe he even had less. He might have been 3 years into it. I don't know. Um, so yeah, so that's his intersection with the Moore Murray case. And so since I've learned that, I've been doing a lot of research into who this guy is and where he comes from. And I'm happy to go into that a little bit.
No, absolutely. I mean, and people ask me about this is really interesting. Do you think that he could have hurt a person or whatever? But I do veterinary forensics, and I know that there's a link between animal cruelty and interpersonal violence, and somebody that's cruel to animals can be violent to people as well. So we'll see how this develop, and hopefully we can have a bonus episode at the end of the series about
Yeah,
Stefan and Mora. So
sure.
I guess let's start at the beginning. Like, who was Stefan as a child? Like, what was his upbringing?
So it's my understanding that, and I have talked to Stefan's father. I had a short interview with him. So it's coming from that. It's also coming from Stefan's autobiography, which I was able to get a copy of. He had written like more than 100 pages of this autobiography that he was keeping on his computer, and that became a part of discovery in this whole case. It was part of what they swiped from the computer. So I was able to read that, and that gave some insight too. But so he comes from um, a big family, but at the beginning it was just him and his older brother, and they both had the same mom and dad. Lived in New Jersey at the time, and his parents went through a very contentious divorce when Stefan was still young, and he and his brother and his mom kind of disappeared for a while. His mom kind of absconded with the boys, and his father didn't know where she was for a while. And then he gets a call one day, and it's from the mother, Barbara. His mom's name is Barbara, and she calls him from California and says, "We've moved to California. The boys need you." And so, to his credit, he was living in New York at the time, I believe, upstate. He moves to California, upends his life, and moves to be closer to the boys. And coincidentally, he was in the animal care business. He's running um, a non, I believe it was a nonprofit too, but he was working with animal care out there, and he ends up taking custody of the brother, and Stefan stays with his mother. And that ends up having a big impact on his life because, according to him, his mother was very abusive, would often hit him, would always yell at him. They lived in dirt poor neighborhoods around LA, so it was also dangerous. He said, in his autobiography, he talks about just reading books at home, and because it was too dangerous to go outside to play. And that's but because of all that reading, he excelled at school, which is how he eventually gets on the track of getting into the West Point Academy that feeds in, or it's kind of a West Point prep school that feeds into, that's how he gets into the West Point um, Academy. So he's very, very intelligent. Um, he had definitely been abused in his childhood. He has a very contentious relationship with his mother. Um, and it was a rough, no doubt about it. He had a very rough childhood. And, it sounds like there were times that if they weren't homeless, they were pretty darn close to it. He was homeless for a time as an adult, around the time that Maura went missing. There is a chunk of time from when he leaves West Point in December of 2001 to when he starts popping up again, like around 2005, and by then he's living in California again. There's this chunk of like 3 years where it's really hard to find anything out about the guy. Um, but he eventually marries a woman out in California, and that's how, in a way, he comes to Ohio because she was originally from Ohio. They started having trouble in their relationship. He claims that she was abusive to him, just like his mother. And they end up moving to Ohio to try to save the marriage. They get to Ohio, they break up, they get divorced, and that's kind of what leads him here. And that's when he starts getting involved with the animals here in Ohio. There are a couple weird things about his family. His mother's missing, which when I first heard that, I'm like, really? But I looked into it, and sure enough, nobody's really heard from the mom since about 2007. And it's strange. When I talked to his father, he said something strange too. He said, "Yeah, nobody's heard from her since 2007. As far as I know, she could be dead and buried in the desert," which is that's kind of an odd
Very
jump to
specific.
make. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know what's up with that. Stefan, from what I understand, turned down some offers from people that offered to try to find her. Um, and then here's another odd thing about Stefan and the timing around the Maura Murray case. He, so in Maura disappears in February 2004. About, that happens in February. In, I think, August, later that summer, he starts applying to change his name because when he was at West Point and all the way up until the end of 2004, he was known as Stefan Finkelstein. And everybody at West Point remembers him as Finkelstein or Fink, they called him. And so, but then just a couple months after Moore disappears, this adult man is like, I got to change my name. And that's when he becomes Stephen Baldwin. Baldwin was his mother's maiden name. And when somebody asks him, he's like, well, I did that to honor my mother, the mother who's now missing. And, he doesn't really seem too interested in trying to track her down. Uh, yeah, so it's very strange. The timing of that name change, it's very rare for a man to change their name, especially at that age. Yeah, I've seen it with like teens and children who, want to honor their like adopted father or something. But, the dude's like, what, 24 years old at the time, 23, somewhere around there. So yeah, everything about this guy's strange. But so to sum it up, he had an abusive background. In his autobiography, he talks a lot about how he puts on this mask of being this happy, easy to like type of guy. But inside, it's dark and he doesn't really understand himself. And he judges people and thinks he's smarter than everybody else. And he in his autobiography says that he always thought he'd end up either homeless or dead or in prison. And he just has this sense of doom that that's where his life is going to lead. Like, why do you think that? What is it that's happened that you think that that's the outcome of your life? And I guess now, he was right. He's in prison.
Yeah, and I know that he often mentioned about his mom having mental health problems. I think he even said that she was bipolar, and then she was either into drugs and or alcohol. So that was part of the problem that he had with her growing up. And I remember him being on a podcast. That he was talking about how he enrolled in the military because he needed to get away from his mom,
Mm.
right?
Yeah,
And
but then you're going to change your name to your mother's name?
right,
Why do you
it's
do
like,
that?
yeah, exactly. It's like this person is abusing me and has made my life miserable, and I ran away from her, and he changed his name before he she disappeared.
Yeah. Yeah. Very bizarre.
Yeah. The other thing that is of interest is like you see patterns repeating, right? When people have traumas in childhood, then they can potentially bring those traumas into adulthood and either be a victim or victimize. And it
Yes.
feels like his relationships with women, I mean, he talks about himself being a victim with his wife, whether that's true or not, we don't know. But his relationships with other girlfriends, it's almost like he was making them into his mother.
Oh, yeah. I could definitely see that. I don't think that's a big leap at all. I've talked to a couple of his former girlfriends, and he was abusive. He was a very scary individual. He lived with a woman out in California for a while. I think it was even like after he knew he was under investigation here in Ohio, and that he probably knew this indictment was coming down. He entered into this relationship and kind of tricked this woman into thinking he was somebody he was not. And she is so upset. She was very nice, but she cannot talk about it yet. She can't talk about anything that happened yet because she's still processing what he put her through. There was a girlfriend here in Ohio that I spoke to that says he pulled a gun on her, um, and that was same thing, just a scary guy when he'd take that mask off and show them who he really was. So yeah, and but so I don't think it's a big leap that he was that these women were in some way like a substitute for his mother and trying to act out like how in his mind he should have acted to her back in the day. I can definitely see that.
Yeah, kind of like he was, he was a child and he was unable to defend himself from his mom, and now he's, getting women who are vulnerable, who are young, and then getting them in this path of destruction, and to a point, then standing up to them
Yeah.
and taking it out on them the way that maybe he wishes that he had done to his mom, or I mean, his mom is missing, maybe what he did to his mom.
Well, he also has two former girlfriends who are dead. I strike that, maybe three. We don't know what happened to Maura. But the two here in Ohio, although, very unlikely he had anything directly to do with it, the police believe it was the way he treated these women that led them to, one had a car accident. She had drugs in her system. The other, overdosed, and she was sober before Stefan pulled her into his um, influence, and it messed her up. And you know the story better than I do, but it's one guy who is the common link to three, to two dead women and two missing women. Uh, at some point you have to like ask yourself, like, what are the odds for all that to be innocent? Who else is connected to that much, you know, just bad things and karma. And then we haven't even talked about the animals. And this guy left a path of destruction in his wake.
And again, that's where I wouldn't doubt if he's related to anything with Mora or his mom or anything like that, just because it follows a pattern, and he was very good at showing, like he even says, his mask. He would go in
Hmm.
front of people and be very well spoken and listen and process and understand what you wanted, and then that was what he wanted as well,
Yeah.
right? So your goals were his goals. And that's how he got, the trust of a lot of people. But on the inside, he was a very dark person.
Yeah. I also think, he talks in his autobiography a little bit about how he doesn't really even know, who he is. That I think whatever like the original Stefan that was in there, I think got lost through all the abuse and everything else that happened. And I think he was becoming aware of that. I don't think Stefan knew who he was. Um, and I think that was a major source of conflict inside his mind. Um, it's certainly interesting. So, whether or not what I'm interested in is trying to figure out if I can link him to Mora after they left West Point. And I asked him when we talked that day at the courthouse, I said, did you ever see Mora again after West Point? And he said, no, 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 that was the last time I saw her. He said, in fact, I've never been north of Connecticut. But in some of his text messages, he's talking about places that he'd love to live. And one of them is New Hampshire, where Maura Murray disappeared. And that's a weird thing to say. Like, if you haven't ever been there, like, how would you know you'd like it enough to want to live there? But that's not proof. Um, but he did lie when he said he's never been north of Connecticut. I did find out that he was at a party with some West Point cadets in Boston, but that might be, maybe he didn't count that because it was just a weekend and not too far north anyways. Um, but he definitely was.
Another of the things is like the relationship with his dad, right?
Mm.
Like there's a lot with that, including the fact that he hired somebody to find his dad. Is that correct?
I never found anything about him trying to track down his dad. I think I remember hearing that rumor, but as far as like the stuff on his computer, I mean, I was able to find his dad in about 5 minutes. He's not that difficult to track down. So it's a weird thing for him to say. And when I did talk to his dad, I can tell that his dad does care for Stefan because I was the one that told his dad that Stefan was in prison. He didn't know that. And I talked to him, I think Baldwin was sentenced on a Thursday. And then I think I talked to the dad on a Saturday. So it was still pretty new. And when I told him that his son was in prison, for maybe 15 years, uh, it took the wind out of him, which is weird when put next to Stefan's autobiography because there are stories in there about his father. He claims that his father was abusive. Um, and there's a letter that he wrote to his father that's just scathing. But other than like him not adopting Stefan, and from my understanding, it was Stefan's choice to stay with his mother. But I can't find anything that suggests that the father was actually abusive or dangerous the way that Stefan makes him out to be.
I mean, if Stefan made the choice, why did he make the choice to stay with his mom versus go with his dad? And is it like a regret that he made the wrong decision and
Hmm.
he has to say, well, I didn't go with him because he was abusive,
Yes.
you know?
Yeah. My hunch is that he made that decision because there was, his father would have supervised him, that, but with his mother, there was no supervision. There was no money and, hard to get food, but at least she wasn't telling him, you know, she wasn't, I don't know. He could pretty much do what he wanted as long as he stayed inside and read his books.
In some of the future episodes, we're going to be talking to people from Top of Ohio shelter, Tops, which is somewhere that he worked for a bit of time. And one of the issues that they were having was about how he, like he wouldn't show up to work or he came into work and would disappear for hours and not clock in. And he admits to some of that in his biography, right?
Yeah, in his biography, he's very clear about what he was doing. He's like, yeah, I was supposed to be at work, and I'd blow off, these people that were counting on me, and go home and spend the day watching porn and masturbating and getting high, you know. And there was a part of him very clearly that not entirely in control of his compulsions. And I'm glad you mentioned this too, the times that he isn't where he's supposed to be, because his girlfriends too talk about how he would take these trips and disappear for sometimes a week at a time. Didn't know where they were. There was one girlfriend he had here in Ohio where he took off on a trip and, 3 or 4 days into it, he left her to take care of the dogs. And, she's having a hard time. So she calls him and he yells at her for interrupting his me time, for his alone time. And, he's traveling the country. He's just like driving around the country. And when I heard about that, of course, my mind goes to Israel Keys, this famous serial killer who would just same thing. He had kind of a normal life, but he would just disappear sometimes. And he would disappear and he would take a flight and then he'd rent a car from wherever he landed and he'd drive 1,000 miles and commit these crimes and then drive back. And like he was trying to cover his tracks. I'm not saying that's who Stefan is. I don't know. But these actions are the actions of a sociopath, and somebody capable of being that type of person.
Yeah, I think that sociopath is the right word for him because, sociopaths lack empathy. They take advantage of people and they have no cares for the harm that they're causing to people.
Yeah.
And those are some of the things that we're gonna discuss as well. Is like, some of the people that he harmed, like he stole money from a homeless person. Like, who does that, right? And he just moves on and doesn't care. Like the people that
Yeah.
he was taking the animals and he's doing these things and he's hurting them and he doesn't care. His girlfriends, and he talks about how he was so affected by his one girlfriend's death in particular, but he never showed that actual, being upset. It's again just telling people what he feels that they want to hear or they need to hear to believe him.
Yeah. I don't think he understands what the emotions are, or empathy is. Like it's even more than like lacking it. I don't think he understands what it is. And I'm sure a lot of that can be attributed to the abuse in childhood, but um, he's definitely a very interesting psychological study for somebody. Even the how he drifted into the field of caring for these potentially dangerous animals is interesting to me. Because one, it's what his dad did. And, according to him, he hated his dad, never wanted to be like him, but he did the exact same thing his dad did. But also, like, does he feel some sort of kinship with these animals? Because he knows, like, is that what he is? Is he a dangerous animal that is trying to be rehabilitated, trying to be better? I think there's a very interesting parallel with that, but I don't know. I'm
Yeah,
not a
well,
psychologist.
right. And the scary part of that though is that if that's what he was doing, he was ending up giving these happy stories of adoption and rehabilitation, but in reality he was killing these dogs. So what, if he's looking at it that way, what was his end game? Like, is was he just trying to find a happy place and if not, then that was the end?
I always wonder, that is for as a true crime writer, that is the most fascinating question for me. I'm always wondering about what these men's end games are. Any serial killer, but any con man too. They get so deep into it, there's no way it can end well. And yeah, so and that had to be going through his mind. At some point, he passed a point of no return, and had to know that it was going to catch up to him. And I was thinking about this the other day, and somebody had a quote from a movie. And I'm trying to remember what movie it is. And I'm drawing a blank, but the quote, this person went up to, oh, I know what it was. It was the movie was Children of Men. Have you ever seen it?
Yes, I have.
Very
Yeah.
good
Mhm.
sci-fi, but like grounded in reality movie. And there's this businessman, dealer who, the world is falling apart and he's gathered like priceless art in his house and he's still like conning people and the main character goes up to him and says, how do you think this ends? Like, aren't you, don't you know that like you shouldn't be having a good time, that this is not going to end well for you? And what he says in response is, I just don't think about it. And I think that's what these people are like. They just don't think about it. And if you can put those blinders on, you can pretend that the end is not going to come.
And I mean, for him, he got away with things for such a long period of time, right? That if you can get away with it and then you step it up and you get away with that and you step it up and you get away with it, I mean, it's never ending. Like he's
Yeah.
he's getting reinforced by those around him that he can do whatever he wants with zero consequence to his actions.
Yeah. I wonder, like, if we could peek 5 years into the future, like how much more we'll know, about what he's responsible for and how
Yeah.
long he's gotten away with that stuff.
No, absolutely. Do you think, like he talks about the reasons that he moved um or he stayed in Ohio was because of his kid, but then he went to California. Like, is there anything on his autobiography or anything that talks about him as a father, how he sees himself as a father?
Yeah, he talks about that a little bit, in that like the first time he felt any sort of empathy and emotion was when his son was born. But I got to tell you, I don't know that I believe that either. And here's why. Because there's evidence from other witnesses and his texts and emails where he's driving around in his car with his son, completely high, out of his mind. And but he has a rule that like he won't get high if somebody else's kid is in there with him. But he doesn't care if it's his own kid, so maybe he felt a little something, but even with his own kid, he's putting his son in danger without really caring about it. And when somebody questions him about it, he's like, no, it's my kid. I can do whatever I want.
Yeah. And well, and when he fled to California thinking that he was going to be able to avoid the investigation and the charges here in Ohio, you know, I have a kid that is about his son's age, and to
Mm,
me, I would not move. I don't care about the job. I don't care about what waits for me on the other end if I'm so attached to my child that I want to stay with them, right? I
yeah.
either take my kid with me or I stick around until my kid is an adult and then he can make his own decisions and then I can move on. So that was kind of out of character for somebody that says that he loves his kids so much.
Yeah, you don't abandon your kid, no matter what. Um, I think that's very telling.
Yeah. And for somebody who feels that he himself was abandoned or he was not treated well, right? Like
Yeah.
you would think that he more than anybody would want to shelter if he truly feels that way.
You know, Something else that I noticed, especially after reading all this stuff that he even says in his own words, so even after all of this, I know he's a dangerous person. I know he's done terrible things. But when I met him outside the courtroom that day, he's charming. He has a way of talking to you and looking in your eyes that puts you, at least at me at that moment when he wants to, puts you at ease. And I found myself like feeling a little sorry for him for a moment. And because one reason is he was acting like he was walking out of the courtroom that day. I'm like, have you made plans? Are you, taking care of yourself? He's like, oh yeah, it'll be fine. I'm not worried. And then he goes in there and he's not getting out for, 15 and a half years. So even with all that turmoil inside, he has a way to mask and present as if he's done nothing wrong. And it's believable. He's got some sort of magic charisma.
I mean, some of the well-known serial killers, that's how they got their victims,
Yeah, Ted
right?
Bundy,
Yeah.
handsome and could convince you to do anything.
Yeah, exactly. And he has the whole his charisma and then he picked the right the right field, animals,
Yeah,
because that's where, a lot of people that care about animals like care about animals.
yeah.
And sadly it's easy to take advantage of somebody that wants to see the best for these animals.
It ended up working out very poorly for him too, because that community is also very, like when you do something wrong to an animal, they will unite and burn the world down to come after you, which is what he found out in the end there.
Does he talk at any point in his autobiography or anywhere that you have listened about his real feelings as far as animals and the taking care of animals, sheltering, training, that kind of stuff?
Not that I've seen, no, which is odd now that you mention it. Um, I don't know that I don't know if he feels that or processes. I wish I could take a peek inside his mind, but it seemed very transactional to him. Um, but you would know that better than me. I mean, I think the way he defended some of these animals that died because of his influence, at the very least, oh, they were dangerous anyways, or it's a dog, it's I don't know, it's very odd. I
Yeah,
don't
that
know what
was
to make of it.
I know that was something really interesting in that podcast that he spoke with, that, he talks about how animals need rehabilitated, and how he can learn about a dog and all that stuff, but then later on during it, he says, like that, like it's just a dog, like it's what they do, like, you can't
Yeah.
you can't change them, you can't fix them. And he talks about how the best predictor of an animal's future actions is their past actions.
Hmm.
But he also is trying to say that this dog bit, but that doesn't mean that it's going to bite again, right? So like all this
Yeah.
contradiction of things.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why I don't think it's almost like there's no like core to his psyche. It just kind of like pivots to like whoever he's talking to or whatever he needs to get out of the situation. But somewhere deep down there, I don't know what that person is.
Yeah.
That's why, yeah, again, a very interesting psychological study at the very least.
Yeah, knowing him, and knowing all the lies that he said, and all the things that he did, and how he got away with things, that was the first time that I really kind of had a good look into him, was during that podcast. Even
Mm.
though I don't feel that he was telling the truth, I could see how he had analyzed
Oh
the
yeah,
host, and he
sure.
was telling the host, I mean, he was one with the host, right? Like
Yeah.
every experience that the host had, he had. And it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, man, me too, me too, me too. And he bonded with this guy, and he just read him perfectly, and he just told him everything that he wanted to hear. And that's where, like some of the things that in one place he says is not okay, in that interview it was okay, because that's where he felt that he needed to go. So really, really good at reading people, and that's why
Oh,
he was able to
absolutely.
get away with things for so long.
Absolutely. I think um, when I met him, this has happened just a couple times in my life with true crime reporting where I meet a suspect. And he was like this, where I could tell he knew more about me within 10 seconds of meeting me and talking to me than I would ever know about him. Like it's a supernatural almost way that these people have of reading another human being to know like what buttons to push, what things to say, what this person needs to hear. I run into that just a couple times, and it's always creeped me out. Um, but I never realize it until later. I'm like, oh, okay. Um, but was there ever a moment where you got like a just a red flag or just a creepy feeling, a vibe or anything?
Yeah, I mean, like, to start with, when I met Stefan, I was giving a presentation on, I say, like signs of animal neglect, and I believe it was primarily in puppy mill dogs. And then he was presenting at that same day, and he was talking about like the role of the animal control officer and what people can do. And he saw that I was interested in animal cruelty and neglect. Like back then, forensics was not a huge field, and there wasn't a lot for me to do. I had started, well, actually, not even at that time. I started working with Humane World for Animals, that was HSUS, years later. But he picked up on the fact that that's what I wanted to do, and I think he figured, hey, I I I got this, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
he came to me and he's like, "Yeah, we can do this, and boots on the ground, and I can do the investigation, and you can do the vetting." And in my eyes, it was like perfect, right? Like I met the almost like the Mulder to the Scully, right? Like
yeah, yeah,
that combination of people that have a same goal, and they bring different things into that partnership.
yeah,
And and that's how he was able to take advantage of it. Now, the thing with me is that I'm personally not a super trusting person. Like that's just the way I am. And I'm not also a very emotional person. So Yeah, he knows what to say or whatever. I never thought that he was cute. I was never attracted to him. I was never like, into that. So he didn't have that over me that he had over other people
Yeah,
that wanted to be with him. Like
yeah,
I truly wanted a working relationship and a partnership.
sure.
So as we started working in different things, he started not doing the things that he was responsible for. And at first it's like, well, he's just, scattered or irresponsible, but it
Yeah.
became a pattern.
Ah,
So little by little, I started doing less and less with him. And then with money, it looked like he was not utilizing money properly and that he
yeah,
was spending money that was supposed to be for the nonprofit on personal stuff. So I
yeah.
started distancing myself from it. I can say that I never in my wildest dreams thought or knew that he was doing the scam that he was doing as far as saying that the animals were adopted or that they were trained and rehabilitated and euthanizing them.
Yeah,
Like that was a big hit for me because we euthanized some of these dogs. There were a lot of other veterinarians that did it, and some of the dogs died under unknown conditions.
yeah,
But it's the being used as a weapon to kill these dogs for him, right?
yeah.
So the manipulation to that point. But yeah, it was, I would say, it probably took a good year, and I feel like I worked with him for years. I worked with him for only about 2 years, and to me it
Oh,
felt
wow.
like an eternity, right?
Sure.
And yeah, it's, as I said on my victim statement, is I have to admit that he had me conned too.
Yeah,
He knew what I needed and what I wanted, and he pretended to be able to offer that to me.
yeah.
And by the time we found out, it was a little bit too late.
I wonder how he's doing, um, how a personality like that does in prison. Like sometimes, that's the best place for them, the structure, the routine of it. But other times, like it just, they just can't handle it. I know I'm really wondering like which how that shakes out for him, you know?
Yeah. And it'll take time to see how things go and if he is able to get off early or if he has to do his full sentencing. And even if he or when he gets out, it's gonna be interesting to see how that goes for him.
And since he's incarcerated now, they do have his DNA on file, if that were to ever, have any sort of match. I mean, fingerprint and Maura Murray's car maybe can be explained away, but if they
Mhm.
get to any sort of DNA. But again, we don't know what happened to Maura. We don't know that it's a murder. There's all sorts of possibilities on the table. All we know, just like his mother, all we know is she's missing. Which again is, when you think about it, it's very hard. People go missing, but usually they're found or their body is found. And Moore's been missing since 2004. His mother's been missing since 2007. Nobody's found either body, which is very rare. Um, so yeah, that's something I wonder about too.
Yeah, it's I mean, as you said, he is a very interesting psychological case. And
Yeah.
it would be very interesting if somebody decided to take that on and try to
Hmm.
figure out what's going inside of his head if anybody can get it
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for being here, and again, hopefully we can have an update as far as your findings and let people catch up on Mora's story.
That'd be great. In the meantime, I am continuing to research into Steffen. I'm reaching out to former cadets at West Point. If you knew him from West Point as Steffen Finkelstein, I'd be very happy to talk to you if you're listening to this. And so there are a couple things that I'm trying to trace down still. And if I find anything, I'll absolutely let you know.
Excellent. And how can people get a hold of you? So, like, if somebody has information, how can they get that information to you?
Yeah, all my contact and anything you want to know about this is at jamesrenner.com.
Excellent.
So
Well,
that's the best place.
great. Well, again, thank you for spending this time for with us and going over this. I think that it gives, especially people that don't know who we're talking about, it'll give them a good idea, and this sets a good base to start talking about all the things that he did.
Yeah. Well, good luck with it. I'm glad you're doing this, and it's important, and I'm sure it'll kick up some new leads. So keep doing what you're doing.
Excellent. Thank you for being here, and for everybody that's listening, thank you for listening, and thank you for caring.